Hello, welcome to the Academy of Management's second ever scholar-led webinar panel. Thank you to our scholar panelists for their time sharing their expert, research-based insights on these critically important topics today. And thank you to everyone viewing. The Academy of Management, or AOM, is the preeminent professional association for management and organization scholars. Worldwide members are professors and PhD students of business schools at universities, academics in related social science and other fields, and practitioners who value knowledge creation and application. Founded in 1936, AOM features a global community today that is nearly 20,000 strong and spans over 120 countries. Today's panel topic, team dynamics in the new pandemic workplace, will explore just how much organizations, the workplace at large, and teams have radically changed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, impacting nearly every organization, employee, and workplace across the world. Our scholar experts will provide their research-based insights to make sense of this workplace evolution and analyze the implications of these changes for organizations and employees in the near term and long term. For attending scholars and media, please submit questions to be considered for answering by our panelists via the Q&A function. We will review and select 2 to 4 questions for our panelists to answer at the end of the webinar. For media that are viewing live or recorded, thank you for your time and coverage consideration. You can access all AOM research or interview the panelists by contacting press@aom.org. This email address will also appear at the end of the presentation. Once again, thank you for your time, and without further ado, I'll kick it over to today's moderator, Dr. Anne Burmeister of Erasmus University, Rotterdam.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm very excited to be here today and to moderate this session with these great panelists who will introduce themselves in a little bit. A quick introduction to myself. I'm an assistant professor of human resource management at Rotterdam School of Management, Erasmus University in the Netherlands. So fast it's already afternoon and it's getting dark. My research focuses on social interactions and knowledge exchange processes between co-workers on the one hand, and diversity and inclusion with a focus on aging, age diversity and inclusive behaviors on the other hand. And my pandemic-related research has looked at how remote working, hybrid or fully remote working models affect the socio-emotional work experiences of employees, the experience of inclusion and exclusion, and what organizations can do to develop and maintain the social fabric of organizations while kind of having to work in these remote models. So unfortunately, the pandemic is not yet over, and organizations are still experimenting with new ways of working, fully remote, hybrid, mixed modes, etc. And I think this is a great learning opportunity of how to do these things better also going forward. The research that has come out since the beginning of the pandemic has pointed to both opportunities and challenges of these new ways of working, and suggests that both individual differences, but also how organizations manage through the pandemic affect whether employees and teams thrive or suffer in this new working environment. So in this panel, I'm very excited to discuss with Ellen, Hakan, and Kira how to manage through the pandemic. And our discussion will be based on empirical research insights rather than gut feeling and intuition, which I think really sets this panel apart from others that you might have seen. And without further ado, I'm very excited to have a quick round of introductions and then pose the first question to the panelists. So Hakan, do you want to start with introducing yourself?
Yes, thank you, Anne. I'm honored to be here with this stellar group of scholars, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to wherever you are. And I am Hakan Ozcelik. I'm a professor of management in the College of Business at Sacramento State University. And I got my PhD from University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, where I think Kira is also from. And I got my undergraduate degrees from Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, Turkey. So 3 different countries. And my research, I've been doing research on emotions in organizations for more than 23 years now, when almost the field has started. So I like to write. And I do research also in topics related to emotions such as leadership and performance and work dynamics. And more recently, I've gotten more interested in the discrete emotions, one of them being loneliness. And that was before the pandemic. When the pandemic hit, it became a very, very important emotion that I think we are all wrestling with right now. So I'm delighted to be here today to contribute from my side to whatever we'll be discussing today, especially focusing on the work relationships and loneliness and some other emotions that are all kicking in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hakan. Ellen, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, I'm Ellen Ernst Kossek. I'm a distinguished professor at Purdue University in Indiana. And I kind of feel sort of mixed emotions about this panel, in that I'm sad that the pandemic has finally made things that I've been interested in for decades, like flexibility, work and family, burnout, is finally hot. So my moment has finally arrived, but it's sad what everybody has gone through. But there are some positives. So I hope today that organizations and the media that are listening and just colleagues will think about how organizations can learn to transform cultures and move forward from the pandemic. I don't think we can go back to the way things were totally prior. And I think many people are rethinking their relationship to work. And I've been studying STEM women. 200 universities in the US just had an article come out on that and how they manage disrupted boundaries. And I have a paper on leadership in work life that has a revision invited for the annals. And I think leading with empathy in work life needs to be integrated into leadership styles more than ever. I'll pass it on to Kira.
Thanks, Ellen. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Kira Schabram. I am an assistant professor of management and organization here at the University of Washington Foster School of Business. My area of research, writ large, is employees who want to make the world a better place. And I study that in ways broad. I study employees who view their work as deeply meaningful and what that means to them. And I'm also interested in smaller gestures. I study compassion, so how employees respond to each other in times of suffering. I can say that has not changed during the pandemic. If anything, it's really just brought those topics more to the forefront, as Ellen has said. So we've seen really that the pandemic has exacerbated why people do the work that they do and how they relate to each other. I'm particularly interested in frontline and social service workers. So my interest is, yes, in the workers who've been able to stay home, but more so the workers who've continued to go to work and what that experience has been like for them and what that's going to be like moving forward. Since we're doing longer introductions, I'll throw in a quick historical tidbit. I'm often very interested in the history of work. And I'll point out that the original conception of meaningful work emerged after the largest pandemic in human history, which was really the bubonic plagues, and what that changed to how we viewed labor. So while luckily we're not going through that right now, I think we are in another period of ferment where we really want to think about, why am I doing this work and what purpose is it serving? So very excited to be here.
Very excited to have all of you here and be able to draw on your experiences and on your research insights, especially in a very much like your positive framing, Ellen, that we can hopefully share some useful insights today to make the workplace better. With that, I might also want to pose the first question to you, Ellen. So based on your research, how has the pandemic altered the experience of work, and maybe also especially relevant to your research, what impacts has this trend had on different groups of employees and teams within organizations?
Thanks a lot, Anne. I think the pandemic has made more visible what was already in the workplace, the inequality that exists for work-life issues, work-life equality, the ability to have work-life balance, control your hours, when and where you work and how long you work, is increasingly, it has been a form of job inequality, but we haven't really recognized that. So as we saw during the pandemic, essential workers, as Kira mentioned, had to go in and expose themselves to COVID, working in healthcare and other areas. And even though it was very challenging, and we don't want to discount the challenges of knowledge workers that were able to telework, there were differences in how the pandemic affected people. So one of the things that I've looked at is how the gender of professional women who were studying STEM, 27% of the US workforce is considered STEM. That is the growth area. And around the globe, there's a lot of interest in technical workers. And I'm not saying everything should be focused there, but that is often a generator for the economy. And what we saw in this recent study that just came out in the Journal of Applied Psychology is that STEM women really, unlike the narratives that they, left the workforce and didn't stay focused on work, we looked at the women who stayed in regardless. And these were academics, long time getting their degrees. And basically, the disrupted boundaries, they ended up spending a lot of energy in how they presented themselves to their colleagues, because the child care centers, the schooling, everything had closed down. And their hope is that there will be, instead of having to conceal their identities, so not just looking at who I am, but we had to make it more visible, how they managed tasks opened up their family and other needs to their colleagues. And perhaps it's time for change to look about how people don't have to hide parts of themselves that are so essential to being who they are as whole people. So I'm going to pass it on. I also wanted to mention one last thing, that if you look at industries such as food service workers and healthcare, there are differences in demography by race and gender and ethnicity, where there are more women and minorities in the industries that generally had to go and do frontline work as well. Passing the baton to anybody else.
Well, Ellen, can I ask a follow-up question?
Mm-hmm.
Just because I am one of those women. I had a kid in June of 2020. Do you think that the pandemic made them decide that I no longer have to wear this professional mask? Or was it just that, well, you cannot hide that there's a child crying behind me? Do you have any sense of that?
Well, yes, we looked at context. So in some departments, we coded whether it was a supportive department and what colleagues were saying and non-supportive. And if you're in the department where people were more socially supportive and also structural supports that people wanted, people did feel more comfortable revealing. We also looked at things like role exit, like I want to give up my career. This is very bad, leaving the occupation versus I'm satisficing. I know I can't totally ignore my family, so I'm going to put all my energy into my child, but I'm not going up for tenure this year. So it was very interesting. There were some people that were motivated by change. And a lot of the identity literature talks about positive distinctiveness and how you share parts of yourself if you're a minority is a way to say, this is a good thing. We cite that literature and think it's great literature, but saw something a little bit different where some people just said, I'm to heck with it. I'm disclosing and I'm hoping that this will lead to change, because universities didn't really respond the way people wanted, like extending the tenure clock for 1 year. A lot of the women said, what's going to be different in a year? There's still surges. There's still kids home. I'm exhausted. I learned how to reteach. I had to salvage experiments. My grants aren't working. So I do think there's this individual and organizational context disconnect in many cases.
That sounds super interesting. And maybe following up before I hand it over to Kira, has this fascinating insight on frontline workers. You said that you coded kind of how supportive the departments were. Can you maybe say a little bit more about that? Like what did a supportive department look like? What did coworkers and leaders do?
Well, I mean, some of it was social, just not saying dumb things like not even acknowledging it, that things were harder, or expecting people to act as if they were before. And there were comments that kind of felt like, oh, don't worry about your work. And the women were going, that's kind of paternalistic and really makes me feel sad. I've spent years getting this. So I think it's realistic support. And then there were things like expecting, people couldn't get technical things, computers they wanted, or things like that, hiding their backgrounds. We've all read about Zoom fatigue and forcing everybody to have their camera on all the time for 8 hours of meetings. That's not very supportive. So I'm sure you guys can add to that as well. But it's a lot of common sense, but we really have not learned beyond this 24/7 boundaryless world this way of sort of maybe having more control about when we're on and we're off professionally. And maybe we can learn from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Using technology wisely, I think, also contributes there to team and individual effectiveness. You don't always need these long, frequent video calls. Audio only can be much more effective if you have a task-related interaction with people who know each other well, and maybe we will get to that.
I want to quickly jump in here, Ellen, because I really found that result fascinating about the distinction between men and women, because we had a study that we conducted about 8 years ago, looking at identities and whether you are investing in your gender identity or whether you are investing in your professional identity. And what we have found is that women who invest in their professional identity more than their gender identity are having a lot easier time when it comes to emotional exhaustion and all that, how they manage the tensions as compared to those who invest in their family identity, and vice versa for men. So men who invested in their family identity actually were better off as compared to men who invested in their professional identity. So a lot of identity building, I think, is in progress right now. With the pandemic, all those relationships got really even more salient. So what's happening, I assume, with both genders is that we are re-exploring the boundaries of our identities. Is that right? What's your feel about that?
Oh, very much so. And I think the framing reflects how the management fields develop. We're used to assume that if one was high in work identity, you couldn't possibly be high in non-work and family identity. And many people today are increasingly dual-centric. They have high identity to both work and non-work. And the more that organizations can make people feel that they don't have to give up part of themselves, the better. And there's old research on roles and whether more roles are better. And in general, having multiple roles is good for well-being as long as you can control how you synthesize those configurations and don't have to feel always pushed and pulled for work-life conflict.
Mm-hmm. And also being able to bring your whole self to work, right? And Kira, maybe that also connects to your research, right? The high identification of the frontline workers.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about it. So again, my area of interest is meaningful work. And I tend to think of meaningful work as a tipping point. So there suddenly is this day almost where you think, wow, my work is deeply meaningful. Or conversely, this is just a job. I'm doing this for the money, and that's okay. I have meaningful things outside of work. There's usually catalyzing events for that. Graduating from college, getting a divorce. The pandemic has created a lot of those catalyzing events, losing your job, getting sick, all of those. So I think the theme here seems to be that people are reevaluating who they are and what they do. And I've certainly found that as well. Now, what we find with meaningful work is that high averages in teams can be really helpful. So if we all here believe that this is really meaningful work, think about a team of physicians or frontline workers, then that can be beneficial both for the team and for me as an individual. I have higher well-being, I have higher performance. The rub comes in when there's variance. If you have a team where half of the members have decided this pandemic more than ever has made me realize that this is important work for me, I'm making a difference, and others on the team have decided, what is the point of this? My employer is not taking care of me. The customers or clients or patients are being rude to me and endangering me. That drives conflict in teams. And so that variance can be really problematic. There's another form of variance that we have studied, and that is variance over time. So we have found that even when employees all agree that this is deeply meaningful work. We did a study with animal shelter employees. This is not well-paid work. These are employees who are coming there because they love animals and they want to save animals. What we found over and over is that a slight difference in time and when they started that job, as little as 6 months, meant that you constantly had new people coming in, judging the people who were already there for, quote, not caring enough, not doing enough, because they were still fresh enough to think that I could do better here, I could do more. And so I think as we're bringing in new employees and as we continue to have higher turnover, you're going to see a lot of that tension. You're going to see misunderstanding between the people who've been there a little longer and who've slightly changed their approach because they've learned, and the new people coming in who mean really well, but think, wow, no one else here cares and I do, let me step up. So I am concerned about that variance and seeing more conflict. And I think it really behooves leaders and organizations to make sure that there's a lot of transparency and communication to mitigate some of those issues.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And would you say, Kira, that that's generating this uniquely high level of identification? Is that a selection question for organizations? Is it a support question, a retention question? Like how would you advise organizations in that?
It's really both. So on the one hand, there are certainly industries that attract people more who have this sense of meaningful work, right? Healthcare or education are great examples. On the other hand, we've seen generational differences. So younger employees seem to have much more of a sense of that. Now, I should put a caveat there. We haven't studied this long enough to know if it's just that young people tend to be more driven by meaningful work or if it's this particular generation. But either way, for the younger generations, so for Gen Z and millennials, up to a third of the working population primarily views work as deeply meaningful. And so I think across industries, employers need to be aware of that. One of the simplest things that we find is realistic job previews. Don't try to sugarcoat what the work is going to be like. Be very honest with employees about what they're walking into and how you're going to support them. And I think to Ellen's point, we should all be more transparent about what work-life balance looks like in here, right? All of those things, how we can support women. I think organizations really should take note that transparency is what employees are clamoring for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And before I bring in Hakan, one thing, because I'm doing the research on age diversity and aging, I would slightly push back on kind of the term of using generations, because from a scientific perspective, we know that theoretically and empirically, those generational differences or assumed generational differences are not really well validated. So I would rather speak about potential age differences that are developmental of nature rather than really grounded kind of in these formative experiences of different generations there.
I love that. And that is so not my expertise. So I'm so glad you're here.
Cool. Hakan, do you have insights for us about how the pandemic has changed kind of the experience of work? You were talking about loneliness in your introduction.
Well, I got some fresh data and some results which directly speaks to what Kira has found, which I find fascinating now. So with my co-authors, Sigal Barsait and Ariana Beats from the Wharton School, right before the pandemic, we were about to start a study. Everything was set. It was going to be in a city with a huge population, and we were about to start, and then pandemic started. And I said, okay, let's wait a minute. Let's redesign our model, and let's wait, because we knew that this was going to go for some time, although we couldn't have predicted that it would go this long. And but we also knew that with the social isolation, something was going to change. And so we really wanted to know, like, what happens. It's almost like a social lab in the world. What happens if you keep everybody social isolated for a long period? And then what happens? Like, they work from home, they stay home, and they've got this COVID anxiety outside. But is everybody going to respond the same way? So what we did was we waited for about 3 months. Everybody was self-quarantining in California, fully self-quarantining. And right before there were rumors of going back to work, we got our time one data. And it was fascinating because you assume that, everybody would feel lonely, but our results show that that's not the case. Actually, if you look at the average loneliness score, that was very comparable to our other studies that we conducted about a decade ago. And so loneliness was not a big problem overall. And actually, further studies that's already been published has shown that loneliness has decreased in the first few months of the pandemic because of the crisis mode, which now we interpret. But what was interesting was some people still felt lonely. So we really wanted to know what happened in that tunnel. Like, so what were this toolkit that helped people to bounce back? Because as loneliness researcher, I was walking in the boundaries of loneliness myself for some time because it was overwhelming. So then what we have found in our results was that there are some individual level resources, including extroversion, like if you are programmed as a personality to reach out to others, and pro-social motivation that's very much in line with Kira's finding, which is my work has a meaning that's beyond my paycheck. Whatever I do actually makes a difference in the world. And the tendency to seek help from coworkers, the degree to which you can easily ask help from coworkers, were related to lower work loneliness, which makes a lot of sense because loneliness usually comes with cycles. If you start feeling lonely, you start behaving in ways that become self-defeating, which kind of self-perpetuates loneliness. So I feel lonely, and I feel like, I cannot reach out to others. And the more I try to reach out to others in strange ways, which is over-disclosing, under-disclosing, not creating a lot of empathy, or not really thinking about other people, makes you even less approachable. This is what we have found in our study, that has shown that actually, which eventually loneliness reduces job performance. So people with those individual resources somehow found a way to take the steps to reach others. And at the contextual level, helping norms and an emotional culture of companion and love buffered those relationships, which is context also mattered. And it was fascinating. Although everybody was staying home, it was a virtual world. The cultural norms still somehow hold some teams together as opposed to others. And so the relationships, if you have created them, kind of sustained you in the process. So this is one finding. The other finding, though, is something to our surprise, because since our data was so rich with regards to the professional backgrounds in the city, we also asked, whether people are self-quarantining, whether they're essentials. So we got this natural divide in the sample that essential employees gave really different response than the others. So we dig deeper into that to see what's happening. So what we have found is that those employees who were declared to be essential and worked on site the full self-quarantining periods, they felt that they are not being valued by their organization. So that resoundingly, and that in turn mediated all sorts of relationships, like willingness to support your organization, pro-social motivation, which is a precursor for loneliness, work engagement, and emotional exhaustion. So those people who were mandated to work on site felt like nobody really cares about us, and everybody is just focusing on people who are working from home. But what about us? And the only thing that buffered that relationship was whether they liked to go to work, and also whether the supervisor actually expressed love to them. So like what we call the emotional culture of love. So again, some of the relationships sustained people, but essential employees, from our findings at the minimum, I can say that really felt that they felt disrespected. So respect, I assume, is a huge phenomena right now that we all have to think about, because if we are about to collect our time to date, I'm so curious to see what's going to happen now, because it's been about 18 months. But I think respect problem is all over the place right now in the workforce.
Mm-hmm. So a key lever also for organizations to make employees feel more connected and appreciated. What would be ways to kind of show this respect to employees? Did you have some qualitative insights into that? Maybe Kira and Ellen as well. You can add to that, of course.
I can quickly give my individual insight, because there are some people who actually are contact people. So I based on our results, I was curious to see what's happening in the organization. One thing that came out was that how the decisions were communicated to the essential employees made a huge difference. And actually, when we were about to present some of our preliminary findings as an aggregated result to them, they were fascinated, because they said, yes, right now actually what we are doing is to address this problem, because we get that. So I think the way you communicate decisions rather than the decisions themselves in a crisis period makes a huge difference, because everybody wants to be treated as a human being with dignity. Just tell me what's happening and why it's happening and what's going to happen next and how much you appreciate me. I think although these are simple elements of communication, in crisis periods, everybody expects that. So do not take your employees for granted, even the most committed ones, because they do want that spelled out to them. So that's one qualitative, in a way, anecdotal finding that we, in a way, we have found.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think that connects to what Ellen was also saying earlier about transparency in the policies that organizations are also implementing. Maybe moving forward with our conversation, I would like to focus on how you think that organizations can promote team effectiveness in today's pandemic workplace. So what would be kind of the changes, the challenges? We've already now talked about ways of communication from Hakan's research, but what have you found, Ellen and Kira? What can organizations do based on your research insights to manage effectively through this pandemic?
Well, to be honest, it's not easy. I've just written an article on flexibility, and I think, and there's also a person at University of London who wrote a paper called The Blinkered Boss, and about how bosses have done a really good job at tasks during the pandemic, but not so good on relationships. And I think that one thing to begin with is, like what Hakan was saying, and Kira as well, is to make putting effort into relationships part of what your daily interactions are. And we were joking in our prep call about, virtual beer tasting or things like that, trying to make the rituals that we would have. I think it was Hakan that said this when we were normally together isn't maybe going to be the same thing to replicate. But I mean, I think as a manager, don't think you have it all, the answers, and I would involve your team in discussing, things people want. So I know, for example, Microsoft tried to do shorter Zoom calls, 30-minute meetings. Now, you might think that that's not helping with relationships, but it does help with burnout. And I think giving workers more control over when they're on and off, and having some ideas of core hours, but not making everybody slog along all the time. One article I did, we talked about having a COVID buddy, where if you had something come up, because we all had it, that somebody else could attend the meeting and then you can talk with them, and it's another way to connect. I'm sure other people have ideas as well. I just want to say, before I get off on hybrid work, I'm a little worried that companies may implement it in a way that will actually have some workers lose control over when and where they work, inflexible flexibility. And I do think this idea of moving forward to be more of a partnership, and how and why purposefully we come together and give people control over when they're on and when they're off for work and non-work.
So involving employees in the leadership and managerial decisions and policy decisions that you're making is a key factor here. And also what you said connects a little bit to my research in how to make informal social interactions kind of a central part of our formal workday. That's what I would like to add to this discussion of what organizations can do. And in my research, interviews have described that as formalizing the informal, which might sound counterintuitive in the beginning, but means to really make room for these informal, not spontaneous, but then they're not spontaneous anymore, but these informal social interactions. And we often focus on the social part of them, kind of the lunches, the happy hours, etc. But what I have also found is that it's very important to make room for task-related informal interactions. We do that in a face-to-face setting very naturally, that we kind of have these side conversations, that we exchange glances, that we ask this question after the meeting when we walk back to the kitchenette, to the water cooler, etc. That's much more difficult in an online environment. So we don't have this time to huddle after meetings and make sense of what the client has said, what different members in the meeting have said. So kind of scheduling this task-related informal interaction time into our workday after or before meetings, I think, is very important for collective sense-making and helps employees to generate this shared understanding, which will make them more productive, but also feel more connected to their team.
And I couldn't agree more. And I can just tell you, like a paper that I just have come out, the STEM paper during the pandemic, the people that I worked with on that during the pandemic as we were quarantining, that was like the height of generative positive experience during the pandemic. So I love this idea of task and focus as well, making the informal formal.
Yeah, cool. And Kira, what have you found? What would you suggest that organizations focus on?
I mean, I feel like we're all saying very similar things. The lens that I put on this is compassion. And I think empathy has been mentioned repeatedly. And so if you'll allow me to digress briefly, the way we conceptualize compassion is this process. It starts with noticing someone else's pain or suffering, and it ends with doing something about it. And so the first question is, how can organizations help their employees notice more? Traditionally, what we found are the main obstacles to that are actually these expectations of professionalism at work, so that you shouldn't show pain or you shouldn't show negative emotions. And then there's physical barriers like Zoom. Both of those are playing a role right now. So organizations can think about, how can we reduce those? Can we allow employees to have more authentic conversations by just being on audio? How can we reduce some of those professional standards, really even small gestures? Maybe I'll dress a little bit more casual and talk about myself as a leader, right? And allow for those more informal activities. In terms of the doing something about it, we have a study on burnout, on compassion and burnout. And what drove us to study it in the first place is that a lot of burnout interventions have been unsuccessful. And so we were interested in examining, what is the agentic role that employees can play in pulling themselves out of their burnout? Now, I'm always a little cautious about saying, hey, just have your employees do it themselves, because I am not trying to get organizations off the hook. I think organizations, A, should make sure that employees aren't burning out in the first place, but B, do everything they can to help. But so in the context of, can employees actually do something for themselves? What we found is, yes, they can. That when employees are suffering from exhaustion, giving themselves permission to take time off, engaging in self-care really helped. When employees were experiencing cynicism, though, what we found is that that was not effective. In fact, other compassion was, reaching out to someone else and doing something nice for them. And so in the context of employees expressing compassion to each other, I think the organization's role is creating opportunities for that, creating spaces for that. That can be silly events like the beer testing, but if you find that employees aren't attending those, really ask them what they're looking for. What are the resources? What are the time they need? Jane Dutton, Jacoba Lilia, Sally Maitlis have extensive research on collective compassion, where they went into organizations where compassion was really alive, and they looked at what was happening there. And it was exactly what you've just recently talked about, you and Ellen, about these opportunities for making the informal. How did you phrase it?
Formalizing the informal is what I introduced. So kudos to them.
Celebrating milestones, having fun together while working. All of those things really help making people get to know each other as people, and that drive compassion in those units. So I'm just echoing what you were saying, just from a compassion perspective.
Yeah, great, but it's still a different take, and we're kind of like moving in the same direction there. Can you also support this take that we have, Hakan, or do you have a different lens on what organizations need to do?
Fully support and add maybe a little bit more. So one thing that I think is so important that we need to realize is that there are some simple essential elements of human interaction that's likely to be swiped with the pandemic. And one of them being informal networks. So since they are so much out there, we tend to ignore them. But right now, I think we are getting deprived of informal networks because of the challenges, the very technical challenges that we face. Because as Kira has mentioned, after meetings, you would walk in the corridor or you walk on campus just to make sense of what's happening. You would meet some person at the meeting and then have a coffee together, which is not happening anymore. So we are having extremely goal-oriented interactions, which I think makes us ironically more efficient. I mean, I can get a lot more done, but like, where is the informal side? The other one is nonverbal cues. I mean, although we do a lot of face reading, the rest of the body is not visible, and we send a lot of messages with our whole body, and we don't get those cues anymore. And also the simple vibe of like, there's a human moment at work phenomena, like being physically together has some even like physical aspects to it that we still have not explored. I'm sure social neuroscientists will soon start finding that emotional energy, all that things. So there's something magical about, coming physically together that's missing, and spontaneity. So just meeting somebody spontaneously and talking about things that you have not planned before, like you don't have an agenda for. And I want to use the metaphor of this, driving culture in America, which was phenomenal for me when I came here, because I'm used to living in a culture where you just get out of your home and walk on the streets, greet people, and maybe meet somebody. But when I get out of my home here, I get onto my car, I know where I'm going. So GPS makes it even more focused right now. And I just go where I want. So I don't even look around my neighbors. I don't meet people. I only see people that I know. So I think the same is happening in our technological environment right now. In Zoom, we go from one Zoom meeting to another. But how about those, sidewalks, right? How about those, spontaneous interactions that really makes us meet people? So I think that's really important. So how are we going to keep those is a big question. I think HR systems need to revamp themselves, and they have to use technology differently. I mean, I would suggest that Zoom might have a default function, so you don't have to arrange an extra meeting. So Zoom has this breakout rooms after the meeting ends or something. I don't know. And I think HR systems, because it's not only employees that are burning out, the CEOs are burning out, the managers are burning out, because I think we are expecting too much from the managers also to deal with the emotional, sufferings and emotional needs of the people. So I think we need emotionally intelligent HR systems. If you look at our current HR systems, like safety, it's like, I don't know how in other parts of the world or in the United States, but I know in California, like an HR system is, unless you break someone's leg, like people, HR doesn't do anything. So, but people actually, even in this period, like attack each other, right? Human being is human being all the time. So there's a lot of interproblems happening, but HR systems are so much behind that emotional needs of employees. So I think we do need to revamp our HR systems so that the burden is diffused to the systems, so that our managers and executives also do not get burned out, and not to mention our employees actually feel more like human beings. So what I would say is actually the move from human resource management to humane resource management, where like humane is, the compassion, but also more civilization. So treating employees as civilized human beings instead of labor force or cognitive intelligent creatures. We are human beings as a whole. And I think HR systems should address that. Thanks.
Before I kick back to Michael, I can see him coming in. I would really like to highlight two aspects that you mentioned that I think were fascinating. One, that we as organizations should collect data on what their employees actually want. I think you highlighted that, Kira, and not offer kind of these activities or socials or whatever if they don't meet the needs and interests of your employees. And humanizing the HR systems and kind of co-creating HR systems and policies, I think is a very important point. And maybe to some organizational practitioners, this might sound a little bit touchy-feely, but I know all of us can appreciate the research, the science behind this that shows that kind of these humane aspects, this co-creation, this social informal interactions, the enablement of this human side of work really has benefits for productivity, for commitment, etc. So I think that is very important to highlight, that it's not just nice in of itself, but it also has effects and beneficial effects for organizations.
Great. Well, fantastic dialogue, really great research-based insights. And before we close here, I just want to pose two final questions, both that were submitted via our Q&A function. So thank you for submitting questions. The first one, and for whoever would like to answer this, you can just jump right in. We don't need to do a roundtable for this first question, but the second one, I would like to do one quick kind of a 30-second final parting nugget piece of advice. But this first question is regarding virtual teamwork and trust. So the question says, virtual teamwork under the pandemic conditions have had positive and negative effects on trust in the workplace. I'm intrigued to hear what your findings have shown in this area, if any. Thank you so much. So really it's getting to the bones of how has virtual team impacted trust in the workplace and amongst teams. So we don't need to have all of you answer this, just one or two would be good. And then we'll close with the final 30-second answer question.
I can jump in because the respect result from our respect aspect in our results speaks to that. I don't think it's the virtual that affects trust. I think it's what organizations did during that period, because organizations behave and we respond to that. And it's kind of weird because we kind of generalize what we see from our manager to the division, to the whole organization. So what organizations have done in this period and what they have not done in this period, I think deteriorated the trust relationship, but I think more than that, respect. So instead of trust, what I would argue is that there's a huge respect problem right now, that people feel like they do not feel being respected by the organization. Maybe that might be added to the trust phenomena. I know trust is a different phenomena than respect, but at the same time, though, I think organizations, like, you test relationships in crisis periods. Like, we don't test each other every day with our people around us, right? But when something happens and you look at how people are responding, when you are in need of help, and if somebody helps you, that reinstates trust. When you need help, and if they don't help you, that breaks trust. And once trust is broken, we know from trust research that it takes years to rebuild. So I think what organizations have done, knowingly or unknowingly, to their employees, they have to do some, inventory to look at the relationships, what's been damaged, and go back there and communicate, and then mend some of the relationships. Because I think a lot has been broken that we don't even know what they are right now. So that goes to Anne's point about HR functions should gather that data and ask employees not only how satisfied are you, but all these specific questions like what's really making you feel disrespected, like why do you feel lonely, what do you expect from your immediate manager as a human being, and so forth. So these questions, I think, are important.
Do we have time for one more quick response?
Yeah, great. Go for it, Kira.
I feel like maybe I just want to give one optimistic view, since we've been quite worried here. Trust is acceptance of vulnerability based on positive expectations, right? And so I think a lot of employees have felt very vulnerable and not gotten those positive expectations. Trust is way down. There are exceptions to that. We have an organization here in Seattle called Gravity Payments that is often held up as this case study of how to treat employees right. They had to ask all their employees to take 40% pay cuts. All employees did it. They've since paid them back and paid them bonuses. So I think there's really excellent examples out there, the minority, but organizations who have thrived during this pandemic because they've built even more trust with their employees. I just thought I'd maybe highlight one of those.
Great. And I think that's always a super helpful aspect of optimism, and especially during these trying periods. So great. So we'll close with one last question. Let's be a round table, kind of a rapid fire, 20 to 30 second answers, please, for each. And it's really, if you had one shot, one sit down with a CEO of an organization, what would be your advice for them to actually do either today, long term, to help improve these team dynamics that have been so radically shifted and altered by the pandemic? Just one piece of advice. I know it's probably difficult, but I think it would be great as a kind of a final parting shot. And then from there, we'll close the panel. Thank you.
Well, one thing I would do is have the CEO talk more with his team down the line on preferences for integration and separation of work and non-work. People have different boundary management styles. And just because people need times they're not online doesn't mean they don't love their job. But people combine work and non-work roles in different ways. It's a form of diversity and inclusion.
Thank you.
I'll speak to exploitation. I study meaningful work. For the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of organizations exploit employees' good intentions. Wow, they're passionate about their work. Let's make them work longer hours. Let's make them work harder. I think that is hitting a breaking point. And so, yes, employees who view work as deeply meaningful want to give more, but it has to be a two-way street or you're going to reach a breaking point. And so that would be my advice to organizations.
My advice would be even, I think, a wave that already started before the pandemic, and they're kind of intermingled now, like this age of big resignation, right? And I don't think that's not exactly because of pandemic, because pandemic kind of moderated or fast forwarded the process. But I think what's happening, especially with the new generation or age difference, whatever, and you want to call it, but we know that the new workforce, like organizations expect different things now from employees, not just, not even cognitive, because robots take care of a lot of the cognitive tasks today also. So we expect, for instance, for like more empathy, more ethical judgment, more emotional awareness, and more imagination from our employees. So what organizations now do is that they want more from their employees. And now, surprisingly, simple rules of social exchange, now employees give that, but in return, they want more than promotion, pay and promotion, and even, respect. So what they want is, high quality work relationships, dignity, personal independence, happiness. So if you want me as a full human being and more, then you want me to treat as such. And I think there's a ton of research that we've already produced at the Academy that I'm so proud of, that like there are so many factors like quality of work relationships, work-family balance, emotionally intelligent leadership, job crafting, intuition, creativity. They've demonstrated that empirically again and again that affects performance, that affects satisfaction. So human beings are more than just cognitive and motivational systems that you give them a reward and they do something for you. So I think as executives, executives would be a lot better off to get deeper into that and really start capturing that human essence and how we can really connect with our employees at the purpose level so that we kind of join forces for a better future rather than have a purely transactional approach. So I think they need to get more intellectual in a way also, more philosophical, and think about those big questions so that they can lead their organizations accordingly.
I completely agree with that. And I would say maybe adding to that or supporting that CEOs or organizational leaders need to recognize that employees are complete people. So we need to appeal as organizations to their minds, but also to their hearts. And one very important aspect of that is creating opportunities for these social interactions, especially when we're in a remote or hybrid work environment, not forgetting about the importance of that, but making that a central part of people's work experience.
Fantastic. Well, I just want to reiterate, thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to everyone attending, whether it's media, AOM Scholars, etc. And this recording will be live on AOM.org in the near future, and it will be available for recording, viewing, and additional follow-up questions. So without further ado, I'll move on to our share screen and bid everyone have a great day, evening, morning, and take care.